If you walk into a typical Protestant church today, you might see the Virgin Mary once a year. She is the silent, static figure in the Christmas pageant, draped in blue fabric, standing quietly behind a wooden manger. Once the carols end and the decorations are packed away, she largely vanishes from the Protestant consciousness. She is treated as a historical necessity, a vessel used and then set aside. For the modern believer, any mention of Mary that goes beyond her biological role in the Incarnation feels dangerously Catholic. There is a deep cultural wall built over centuries, separating the Protestant Jesus from the Catholic Mary. Many believe this has always been the case, that the Reformation was a clean break where Martin Luther and John Calvin heroically removed Mary to ensure that Christ alone received glory. We have been raised on a Sunday school narrative that says the Reformers abolished the Virgin Mary. But here is the spoiler. This narrative is a modern invention. The Reformers were not nearly as Protestant as we are today. Imagine hearing a 16th century preacher proclaim that Mary was ever virgin and should be honored above all other saints. You would assume he is a Roman Catholic priest. You would be wrong. It could easily be Martin Luther or Ulrich Zwingli. Looking at the primary sources, the actual ink spilled by the men who led the break from Rome, we find a Mary who is vibrant, honored, and deeply integrated into their theology. Luther wrote that Mary is the highest honor and the most blessed of all women. Calvin insisted we cannot truly appreciate the blessings brought by Christ without acknowledging the high honor God conferred upon Mary. These are not the musings of a pope, but the convictions of the Reformation's founders. The disconnect is so profound that if Luther walked into a modern Baptist or Pentecostal church, he would be appalled by the Mary silence he encountered. To understand this, we must look at the religious landscape of the early 1500s. The Reformers were not starting a new religion. They were purifiers. They were like art restorers trying to remove centuries of grime to reveal a masterpiece's original colors. They wanted to return to the Church of the Fathers, where Mary held supreme honor. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. A critical battleground was the term Theotokos, a Greek word meaning Mother of God. While modern evangelicals often shy away from this phrase, the Reformers fought to keep it. For them, it was a shield protecting the divinity of Jesus. They realized that denying Mary was the Mother of God was essentially denying that Jesus was truly God from the womb. They feared that by ignoring her title, they would inadvertently fall into ancient heresies. The conflict for the Reformers wasn't about whether Mary should be honored, but how. They made a distinction lost to many today, the difference between veneration and adoration. They argued that while worship belonged to God alone, profound honor belonged to the Virgin. They saw her as the treasurer of grace and a model of faith. As we journey through their private writings and official confessions, we find a story that challenges modern identity. We will see that sola scriptura didn't lead them to ignore Mary. Instead, it led them to a view more traditional and mystical than the rationalistic faith many hold today. We are entering a timeline where the heroes of the Reformation defended Mary's perpetual virginity and unique holiness with a passion that would leave modern audiences speechless. They weren't looking to create a minimalist faith, but a corrected one. This sets the stage for a journey through the private writings, sermons, and official confessions of the giants who shaped Western Christianity as we know it. We must ask ourselves if our modern, reformed theology would even be recognizable to the very men who birthed the movement, or if we have lost something precious. Martin Luther is often portrayed as an iconoclast, yet his personal life tells a different story. He remained in many ways the Marian monk, until his final breath. For Luther, Mary was not just a biological vessel, but a supreme example of God's grace working in humanity. He continued the practice of praying the Magnificat daily, finding in Mary's song the perfect articulation of how God exalts the humble and casts down the proud. This was not a vestige of his old life that he forgot to discard. It was a central pillar of his theology. In his 1546 sermons, the very year he died, he reaffirmed his unwavering belief in the semper virgo, the perpetual virginity of Mary. He argued that Mary remained a virgin before, during, and after the birth of Christ, seeing this as a necessary supernatural sign of the unique nature of the Incarnation. Even more shocking is his nuanced view of her sinlessness. While he rejected the later Roman dogma of the Immaculate Conception, he held to a preliminary view. He believed that at the moment the Holy Spirit overshadowed her, her soul was purified, making her a fitting tabernacle for the Son of God. If Luther's devotion is surprising, Ulrich Zwingli's stance is even more radical. Zwingli is remembered as the rational reformer who argued that the Eucharist was a memorial, yet when it came to the Virgin, he was a fierce protector. He insisted that Mary deserved the highest honor and was eternally pure. In the Swiss Reformation, Zwingli stood firm in his defense of Mary's dignity. He publicly condemned anyone who suggested that Mary had other children after Jesus, viewing such claims as an insult to the Mother of God. In his eyes, to suggest that Mary was an ordinary woman who had a large family was to diminish the singular nature of the event that changed the cosmos. For Zwingli, Mary's purity was a reflection of the purity of the Christ she carried, and he maintained that she remained a virgin, her life as a testament to her total consecration to the divine plan. John Calvin, the cautious scholar, brought a more restrained approach. Calvin was notoriously careful with his words, wanting to avoid any practice that might lead to superstition. He rejected the title Queen of Heaven, fearing it placed her in a position that rivaled God's sovereignty. However, this does not mean he ignored her. Calvin frequently referred to Mary as the treasurer of grace and a teacher for believers. When it came to the debate over the brothers of Jesus in the Gospels, Calvin used linguistic skill to defend Mary's perpetual virginity. He argued that the term brothers in the biblical context often referred to cousins rather than biological siblings. For Calvin, the idea that Mary would have other children after bearing the Son of God was unthinkable, as it disrupted the theological significance of her unique role. Above all, these giants were united in their defense of the Theotokos. They understood that the title Mother of God was not about Mary's status, but about the nature of Jesus. They argued that if Mary is only the mother of Jesus' human side, then the person born was not truly God. To deny the Theotokos was to embrace the Nestorian heresy, which divided Christ into two persons. Luther and Calvin believed that the child in the womb was the creator of the universe, and therefore the woman carrying him must be called the Mother of God. For them, this was a Christological necessity that could not be compromised without endangering the doctrine of redemption. They saw Mary as the ultimate bridge between the testaments, whose humble yes allowed the infinite to enter the finite. This profound respect for Mary's role was not a secondary issue or a holdover from their past. It was deeply woven into the core of how they understood the divine mystery of salvation and the radiant person of Christ Jesus himself. If the 16th century reformers were so adamant about honoring Mary, a haunting question remains for the modern believer. Where exactly did she go? The transition from the high Marian theology of the Reformation to the modern Protestant silence was the result of a slow, tectonic shift in Western thought that began in the decades following the deaths of the giants. As the 16th century gave way to the 17th and 18th, the religious landscape of Europe was scarred by the brutal wars of religion. In this era of deep-seated bloodshed, theological nuances were frequently sacrificed on the altar of tribal identity. To be Protestant increasingly became defined by a negative: to be not Catholic. To distinguish themselves from Rome, later generations stripped away anything traditionally Catholic, because the Roman Church was doubling down on Marian dogmas during the Counter-Reformation. The Protestant response was a reactionary retreat. If the Pope elevated Mary, the Protestant pulpit responded with a permanent silence. This reactionary phase was further fueled by the dawn of the Enlightenment. The 18th century brought a wave of rationalism that sought to demystify the faith entirely. While the original reformers like Luther and Zwingli had read the scriptures through the lens of the great tradition, valuing the mystical and historical interpretations of the early church fathers, the Enlightenment introduced a more literalistic way of reading the Bible. This modern lens lacked the appetite for the perpetual virginity or the sacred title of Theotokos. The mystical reverence that the cautious scholar John Calvin held for Mary as the treasurer of grace was replaced by a sterile, academic approach that saw her merely as a biological instrument. The Mother of God title, once a mandatory shield for Christ's divinity, began to feel like a superstitious relic to the rationalist mind. This shift gave birth to a specific type of identity politics within the faith that persists to this day. For the modern Protestant, silence regarding Mary is often misidentified as a badge of biblical orthodoxy. We have reached a point where the average believer feels an instinctive sense of discomfort when the Virgin Mary is mentioned outside the context of a December sermon. This silence is not a product of the Reformation itself, but a product of the centuries of polemics and rationalism that followed it. It is a psychological wall built by history, not by the primary sources of the faith. Examining the private writings of these men reveals that our modern identity is often a rejection of the very heroes we claim to follow. The Sunday school narrative that suggests the Reformers abolished Mary to focus only on Jesus is a historical fiction. For them, honoring the Mother was the most natural way to adore the Son. This brings us to a moment of intellectual honesty. If you identify as a Protestant, you must ask yourself if your theology is truly reformed, or if it is a modern invention shaped more by the Enlightenment than by the Reformation giants. Would Martin Luther recognize your Sunday service? Would John Calvin be confused by your reluctance to call Mary the Mother of God? To find the answer, one must go beyond the modern pulpit and return to the primary sources themselves. Read Luther's Commentary on the Magnificat, where he breathes with devotion for the humble handmaid. Consult Calvin's Institutes to see how he defends the honor of her who bore the King of Kings. These documents are rarely discussed today because they challenge the comfortable boundaries of our modern denominations. Reclaiming this lost, reformed view of Mary could serve as a powerful bridge. In an age of deep Christian division, Mary could be the figure that brings us back to a common heritage. By rediscovering that the Reformers sought to purify her honor rather than destroy it, we find a middle ground that respects both the absolute sovereignty of Christ and the unique dignity of his mother. The Reformers were clear: we do not pray to Mary, but we must never forget her. They rejected adoration, but never intended to silence the veneration that the Scriptures demand. The journey of the Reformation was never meant to end in a vacuum where the Theotokos is ignored. It was meant to lead us to a deeper understanding of the Incarnation. It is time to stop running away from the Virgin Mary and instead look to her as the ultimate model of faith. Only by embracing our full history can we hope to understand the depth of the mystery that began when the infinite entered the finite.